Okay, last time we considered the possibility that one could make an argument grounded in the principle of beneficence for suggesting that the government has an obligation, or the society has an obligation through government, to increase access to healthcare, maybe even universal access to healthcare. In critiquing that idea, I suggested that the primary purpose of government, or the primary responsibility of government, is to protect and promote justice or rights, and suggested that the strongest possible argument for expanding access to healthcare would be one grounded in justice or rights. And that is the topic of the lecture today. We'll be looking at three questions today, or three sorts of questions. First is this: does justice require greater access to healthcare in the United States, or even universal access to healthcare, at least for all citizens, if not for all people living within the boundaries of the United States? Related to that, and maybe another way of asking the same question, is there a right to healthcare? A positive right, requiring someone's assistance in, or the government's guarantee of access to healthcare. And third, if there is such a right, who should pay for it? In terms of higher taxes, in terms of reduced profits, possibly, in terms of reducing the cost of healthcare so that we can increase access. Who pays the price in terms of cuts for other programs or other aspects of human welfare that will have to receive less money because of what we're putting into the guaranteed access to healthcare? Those are the questions we'll be raising today, primarily the first two. Does justice demand access to healthcare? Is there a right to healthcare? We'll be looking today, or considering today, three general approaches to justice and access to healthcare. Three general approaches to that problematic relationship between justice and equality. And we will be looking at these three approaches in terms of those three distinct ways we have suggested that people are equal, related to three of our principles. We'll be looking at the question of our autonomous nature, or our shared capacity to think, choose, value, act for ourselves, for our shared capacity for self-governance. We'll be thinking about our physical nature, the fact that we have bodies and therefore are equal in our vulnerability to injury and to harm, and ultimately to death. And we'll be thinking about our shared social nature, the fact that all of us depend upon each other, or depend upon others for our happiness, for our welfare. And it's in relation to those three possible bases for human equality that we'll be thinking about the question of justice and access to healthcare. The three approaches we'll be looking at are libertarian, socialist, and liberal. A libertarian approach is one that tends to focus exclusively on our autonomous nature as the basis of human equality, and sees justice as the enjoyment of equal liberty. So from a libertarian perspective, the most important thing that we are owed is freedom to think, choose, value, and act for ourselves. And a system is just so long as everyone has equal liberty. A socialist perspective tends to focus on our physical and to some degree our social nature. Justice from the socialist perspective, involves equal access to the goods necessary for life and to enjoy social equality given our physical and our social nature. Liberal understandings of justice seem to me attempt to balance all three of these dimensions of human equality, and particularly tend to try to find a balance between liberty and equality. And the focus of liberal justice is equal opportunity. Unlike socialism or a socialist, a liberal does not necessarily think that folks should be absolutely equal, but certainly everyone should have access to all that is necessary to give them an equal opportunity to achieve social stature, economic wealth, and other human goods. So let's consider the libertarian approach to justice in greater detail. As I've said, it's an approach that emphasizes, yes, human beings are equal, but we are equal primarily with respect to our shared capacity for self-governance or for autonomy, and therefore justice is when we enjoy a situation of equal liberty in terms of being equally free from interference in our lives by others, and particularly interference by the government, who is probably most tempted to inappropriately interfere with our lives. Now, from such a perspective, any distribution of income and wealth, any equal or unequal access to goods and services like food, like shelter, like healthcare, is just so long as the process whereby we arrived at that particular distribution is free of unjust interference, is free of coercion. So Robert Nozick, the famous libertarian philosopher at Harvard, argues that if you take a snapshot of income distribution, one that would show wide income inequality, that actually tells us nothing about whether or not the situation or the process has been just. He argues that any distribution of wealth, however unequal, any lack of access to, let's say, to healthcare because one lacks the resources to purchase healthcare or purchase health insurance, any such distribution is just so long as the process whereby we arrived at that distribution has been one that's free of coercion. Now, obviously, if people are poor because they've been coerced, because they haven't been free to make the choices they want to make, obviously, if income inequality is a result of slavery, for example, then that's unjust. But simply because there's massive inequality, simply because 50 million people don't have access to health care, is no indication of an injustice from this perspective until we analyze the process whereby that situation arose. From this perspective, there is a negative right to health care. That is to say, no one should stop you if you seek health care or if you seek to purchase health insurance. But there is no recognition here of a positive right to health care, that someone has an obligation to help you get health care, that the government has an obligation to increase access to health care. No, not from a libertarian perspective. Now, surely expanding access to health care from this perspective might be seen as necessary to improve human welfare, but any coercive attempts to create greater access to health care, that is to say by taxing people against their will, is itself unjust, and therefore only a negative right to health care. In no sense that people have a positive right to access to it is consistent with a libertarian point of view. Kai Nielsen's essay on pages 277 to 283 in your Spiral textbook, represents a socialist approach. Nielsen begins with the affirmation that equality means that the life of everyone matters and matters equally. So that is his fundamental starting point, a profound affirmation of equality, although a very different one from the libertarian one, because it's not focused exclusively on equal liberty. Rather, it's a sense that that one's life matters the same as everyone else's. Nielsen's essay is interesting, and his argument is interesting because he denies that his commitment to equality, which we're going to see justifies, in his eyes, nearly perfect equality with regard to income and wealth and health care. He denies that this emphasis on material equality is any way in conflict with autonomy. He says that because he thinks having access to resources is necessary and essential to one being able to act autonomously. This is sometimes called an understanding of effective liberty. So it's not enough that I'm able to make choices, that people don't interfere with me in the making of choices. It's rather my choices have no effect unless I have the resources to actually make those choices matter, you might say. He argues that institutional arrangements should strive to meet what he calls all people's course of life or basic needs, so that they have what he calls equal whole life prospects. So you can see here, this is not absolute equality in terms of income and wealth and access to resources, but certainly equal access to all of one's course of life or basic needs, so that everyone has equal whole life prospects. No one dies young simply because they didn't have access to food, shelter, or health care. Everyone has the same possibility, the same chance, to the degrees within human control, to live a full, long, and happy life. And on this basis, he argues for a right to health care, grounded in the claim that health is, in fact, a basic need, or certainly that access to health care is a fundamental, basic human need. Now, from this perspective, medicine should be taken completely out of the private free enterprise economic sector. From this perspective, healthcare professionals should be, like public school teachers, like policemen, like soldiers, government employees, paid a salary by the government to provide health care for the citizens, rather than paid directly by their patients or by their patients' insurance companies. This is because, from this perspective, health care is a fundamental human need and a fundamental human right. Okay, let me talk finally then about a liberal approach to justice and to access to health care. I have said previously that a liberal approach is one that tries to balance all three aspects of our possible equality: our autonomous nature, our physical nature, and our social nature. I think the first thing that's important to understand is that a liberal approach does show a profound appreciation for liberty as non-interference. Now, it is not, as in the libertarian perspective, the exclusive focus of an understanding of justice, but surely a liberal is always troubled by any interference with human liberty, and liberals generally support a wide range for human freedom. There is also, in the liberal perspective, a willingness to tolerate some social and physical inequality. Indeed, I would say there's a toleration for fairly profound material, economic inequality. There is, however, in the liberal perspective, a commitment to a baseline of economic equality or to the provision of basic needs. And the focus, and I should have had it here on the slide, is on equal opportunity. For the liberal, the concern is that every human being have access to that income or that wealth or those goods and services which are necessary for that person to have the same opportunity as everyone else to get rich or to thrive or to climb up, you might say, the social ladder. But the focus here is not on radical or absolute equality, nor is it on radical or absolute liberty. Rather, it's on the balancing of those two such that everyone has an equal opportunity. So liberals have supported typically public welfare to make sure that there is a social safety net that prevents anyone from falling into abject poverty such that they could not lift themselves out, but not as a socialist might for promoting of a near absolute equality. Now, from this perspective, liberals may or may not argue for a positive right to health care. Some liberals do think such a right exists, some do not. But surely all liberals would tend to support greater and possibly even universal access to health care, or at least some level of basic health care, as a matter of justice, as a matter as something necessary to support and sustain every person's opportunity to succeed or thrive and have social status and economic status in society. Well, hopefully that provides you a basic understanding of three general approaches to questions of justice as it relates to healthcare: libertarian, socialist, and liberal. In our next iMovie lecture, I will offer a possible argument for a right to healthcare.